Another story, that the big provincial story in British Columbia this week has been the Agricultural Land Reserve and Pat Pym. He's the Minister of Agriculture. And when he was, after the election in 2013, when he was an MLA-elect, he was approaching the Agricultural Land Commission to get farmland removed from the Agricultural Land Reserve. What happened in the early 70s was the NDP government set aside all the farmland, so you couldn't develop on land that was classified scientifically as good farmland. So over the years, periodically, sometimes land gets removed from this reserve for development, but it's always controversial whenever this happens. And now, in Fort St. John, a businessman up there named Terry McLeod wants to build a rodeo, but he wants to do it on farmland. So Pat Pym, as the MLA, was trying to help him, and Pat Pym's constituency assistant also wrote a letter to the commission. What happened was the land was not removed. Pat Pym became the agriculture minister, and then the commission wrote a decision heavily criticizing Pat Pym for interfering and saying that their policy is such that elected officials should not be contacting quasi-judicial bodies, and this is a quasi-judicial body that is making legal determinations in the case of farmland. So Pat Pym has not resigned. A group called Integrity BC has demanded his resignation, but he's staying on. The Premier has not thrown him overboard as of yet. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. And this issue is festering, but it's also speaking to concerns among some people about the BC Liberal government's commitment to the Agricultural Land Reserve. When Gordon Campbell was Premier, there were approaches from the business community and from the Fraser Institute that saying, you know, this Agricultural Land Reserve is an impediment to development, it's undermining the economy, it's keeping housing prices high. The Premier would not go along with that, and the Premier also, of the day, Gordon Campbell, had an interest in climate change, and one of the issues about keeping the farmland is for food security for British Columbia, if, in fact, climate change and the changing weather patterns actually have an impact on food production in the southern U.S. There's real issues about the amount of water in the Colorado River. So preserving our farmland, there's a good argument for doing that, but now the perception is that perhaps the new Premier, Christy Clark, is not as committed to doing this as Gordon Campbell was. She doesn't have the experience as the chair of Metro Vancouver, as Gordon Campbell did, in creating the Livable Region Strategic Plan. She's never evidenced, a great deal of interest in land use planning. She's never been a municipal politician. And she's also proposed a very expensive $3 billion bridge connecting basically farmland in Richmond to farmland in Delta. And that has raised fears in some circles that eventually that could lead to an erosion of the protection of farmland. So the issue up in Fort St. John is a flashpoint. At the same time, the core review, which is overseen by Minister Bill Bennett, is reviewing all sorts of regulations. There have been, Pat Pym his ministry was looking at whether the Agricultural Land Reserve and the Agricultural Land Commission, that whether they should revisit the rules on that. Bill Bennett has said publicly that they don't plan on making changes, but at the same time, the NDP opposition looks at what's happening, and they've called for Pat Pym's resignation. So that's the big provincial story. There have been a couple of other, it wasn't a very good week actually last week for Christy Clark, because at the same time you had the representative for children and youth, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, issue a report saying that the government had wasted $66 million on a bunch of meetings and processes to look at Aboriginal child protection authorities. Nothing ever came out of that. And she said not a penny actually went into real child protection. So that was not good news for the Christy Clark government. But at the same time, the NDP is kind of meandering along. They've got a leader. They don't have a leadership race yet. They're coming into their convention this weekend, we'll see whether that gives them any momentum. The last story I'm going to talk about is a big rally at Science World that was held on Saturday to protest the Enbridge pipeline. This is a major national story where Enbridge, a Calgary-based company, wants to build a pipeline connecting the tar sands to Kitimat, and then that would enable oil to be shipped to Asia. There have been a lot of discussions between the governments of Alberta and British Columbia, but ultimately the decision will be made by a federal joint review panel under the environmental assessment legislation and the National Energy Board. At the end of the day, it's Stephen Harper and the Cabinet are going to make the decision. They could declare the pipeline in the national interest, but at the same time, there's a lot of opposition in British Columbia, particularly among the Aboriginal communities. So the pipeline story remains alive. It's going to continue to be a major story right through 2014 and possibly even right up until the next provincial election in 2017. So that's all I've got today. So for WOW TV, I'm Charlie Smith, editor of the Georgia Strait, and thanks for being with us.
感谢收看今天的大温故事，我们下期再见。